Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketing professional with a real interest in digital transformation, change management, and amazing content. I live in Melbourne, Australia, with my husband and two mostly delightful children. Having worked in marketing roles in the UK, US, and Australia, I've met many inspiring people and benefited enormously from the power of network and community. In this Katie Talks podcast series, I uncover the stories of influencers sharing their thought-provoking business and leadership insights. And I don't think I've ever had a conversation that is so relevant. My guest today is Hiam Sakakini, a transformational change consultant who is passionate about discovering what great companies do different from the rest, what great leaders do, what kind of culture they have, and how they nurture and develop that culture. And we're about to clock over 6 months of working from home and homeschooling due to COVID in Melbourne. These are all things that I've been thinking about heaps, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Hiam, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. Really excited to be here.
Look, I'm really, really looking forward to it. And, you know, I think all of the areas that you spend your life focusing on are so relevant in this strange COVID way of working. I think it's going to be a really good conversation.
Yeah, definitely. This has definitely thrown a lot of cards up into the air as far as the workplace is concerned. So it's been really interesting just to watch myself what's been happening and see how people are reacting to the circumstances they've been thrown into.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, let's get into it. You're a specialist in change management and a keen studier of what great companies do that is different. And we've been hearing an awful lot about trust in a professional context. Talk me through this.
So trust, I suppose, whether it's in a professional or personal context, it's not too dissimilar. Sometimes we're in a group of people, be it a team or be it, you're out and about with your group of friends, and a topic comes up and you might feel uncomfortable to speak your mind. Maybe there is a kind of group consensus happening in that particular situation that you are worried about going against the grain. So it's those moments of holding back, potentially fear of judgment. Those are the tiny little minutes that potentially, if you did step forward, problems could be solved, or you could change somebody else's perspective. So I kind of look at trust in those little milliseconds or micro moments where people decide to step forward or hold back. And it could be in a personal or a professional context. Because I do believe it's in those moments that potential opportunities are sitting and waiting to be harnessed.
That's really interesting. I'd love to understand a bit more about that. So, I'm familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but getting into that a bit more, what can success look like, and what does psychological safety in the workplace look like?
Yeah, it's such a buzzword now, psychological safety in the workplace. When we see teams that have high levels of psychological safety, we invariably see teams that feel empowered to make decisions, knowing those decisions are obviously in line with company goals and values. We generally see a flat structure, not too much hierarchy. That allows innovation to flourish. We feel like we can make decisions and own those decisions as if we almost own the business. Mm-hmm. And even if we make mistakes, we don't hide them. That's a real differentiator in businesses with high psychological safety. Mistakes are inevitable. The difference is that they're not hidden. In fact, they're shared so that they're not duplicated. Okay. And others avoid making those same mistakes, right? Mm-hmm. People can learn from mistakes, and sometimes even in those learnings, innovation can happen. I think we all know of great products and services out there that have been born as a result of a mistake. For example, I guess Post-it notes were as a result of a mistake made in a lab, the whole story behind it is they were trying to create some kind of strong adhesive. They ended up with a very weak adhesive. And the result was that you could
I didn't know that.
pieces of paper yeah. And lo and behold, a runaway success was born out of a mistake. So I think knowing that, leaders demonstrating that mistakes are fine, that they can be learned from, that how you deal with them is the main thing, is really, really important.
That's really interesting. What is it about a structure being flat that adds to psychological safety?
Yeah. It's interesting. The old models of hierarchical teams are changing, especially now as we move to a more distributed workforce. We're noticing that we're becoming a network of teams, more of a matrix structure, that individuals can belong to 2 or more teams, and that the goal is really project delivery as opposed to being defined as solely in one team and in one area. And I think that is great in terms of career progression, being exposed to many facets of a business, to the customer from many angles versus just one angle. It creates empathy across the business. It just means that there is less need for those hierarchical structures. So it's great to see, because I personally believe those hierarchical structures are where time is lost, looking for, approvals and red tape to be cut and so on and so forth to get an idea up the line or a request for budget up the line and so on and so forth. So the more we can break down those structures, the quicker we can move. And really being agile in today's world is super, super important for businesses.
Oh, isn't it? And everything you've described there is very much the way that I like to work, having that autonomy to to really make some key decisions and just really push along, be innovative in what I'm doing, rather than need to be constantly checking back and seeking approval.
Exactly, and being treated as the adult that you are. I mean, in your personal world, I'm sure that you make very big decisions all the time, whether it's to do with your kids or potentially parents or potentially a mortgage, big decisions.
Yeah.
So why should you be stripped of that capacity when you enter the workplace? Surely that's what you're hired for. So it's an interesting thing that happens when we enter the workplace in terms of that capacity not being valued or used.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. Harnessing those elements rather than diminishing them. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Absolutely.
So, Hiam, as a follow-up to that, what does the absence of trust in a workplace look like?
That's a funny one. Everybody that I ask that question to, whether it's clients that I work with, roundtable discussions that I have, this one is easy for people to answer. They throw out so many examples and it makes me laugh. And I hear the same things over and over again when I say, what does absence of trust look like? And the same things come up, things like hiding information that we know might be useful to a colleague or another team. That seems to be one that comes up. Covering your back, which usually results in a million people being CC'd on an email, potentially, which then clogs up inboxes and wastes a hell of a lot of time, but feeling like you have to CC everybody in. Another thing is too many meetings and too many people in those meetings. There's not necessary for that many people to be there in order for that meeting to be successful or some kind of outcome to be achieved, but feeling that we have to include people so they feel informed. Again, what I mentioned before, a lot of red tape, lots of layers, lots of wasted time to make decisions, lots of approvals required. And there, again, you'll notice that there's just lack of innovation. This organization is not coming up with anything new, anything creative to meet their customer needs, very much internal focused and not external focused. There may be also a huge amount of fear, just a general environment of fear that people are operating in. So it's not fun, I would imagine. Overall, I would imagine it would be an uninspiring place to work. People would feel very much like a cog in a wheel.
Yeah.
I would imagine there'd be a lot of stress, absenteeism, sick leave, high churn rates, employees leaving. I would imagine that, you know, people wouldn't talk very favorably about the organization, which might lead to, you know, recruitment issues, which again then means you're lowering the bar in terms of hiring. So it becomes then a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of what it can do to a workplace having low trust.
Ugh. I was feeling so
not fun.
No,
bit of a downer.
Totally. I was feeling buoyed after the talk about psychological safety in the workplace, and now I'm just thinking, I'm feeling really quite flat. But let's move on to something much more positive. You mentioned at the start of our discussion distributed teams, and I'm really keen, you know, given that I'm recording this while hiding in my bedroom away from children. Which is the quietest part of the house. When we spoke earlier, you talked about interconnected but distributed teams, and that's really critical in the way that we're all working from home right now. So can we dig into that? I'd love to hear some more about your thoughts around this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Overnight, globally, we've kind of been thrown into this mad workplace experiment, and everything from where we work, how we work, everything has changed super quickly, and we're still trying to get our heads around it. But yeah, remaining interconnected while we are essentially socially isolated has been a huge trend in terms of topic of discussion. So what I've noticed is that we've lost those incidental interactions that we would have had in a place, in an office place, those kind of water cooler conversations, coffee chats, just passing each other, going over to somebody's desk. It's all gone. And we're trying to replace that with a lot of virtual meetings. So we have all of our general in-person meetings are now replaced with virtual meetings. Then those interactions, we're trying to replace those with, you know, Friday wind down sessions or whatever it might be. And so there is a lot of that interaction over Zoom or Teams. It's really becoming super draining. So now I'm noticing after people have flipped from one completely to the other, they're now starting to find a little bit of space in between where you can be connected without having to just default into a virtual meeting. And that's really lovely to see. People are having, for example, walks, going out and actually meeting, but socially distancing and actually having a human-to-human walk with one another instead of your typical one-to-one meeting over Zoom or maybe a phone call. And, you know, leaders are now seeing that they need to actually ask their employees to leave the house if possible. You know, that there's different levels of lockdown in different areas, but you know, let's do our meeting over, you know, good old-fashioned phone. I want to hear your feet hit the pavement.
Yeah, okay.
So we're seeing a little bit more of that, and I think that's really helpful.
Yes.
And I just think overall, when people do go back into the workplace, you know, it's going to look very, very different. And maybe the workplace will be used from more of a collaboration point of view rather than I go in there to sit down and do my work and leave 9 to 5. So I think there'll be a whole different definition of what interconnected looks like in the workplace, and it's evolving slowly, which is great to see. Really enjoying it, watching it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in that element. I mean, this possibly sounds like a somewhat insensitive or crass thing to say, but the vast bulk of the impact of COVID-19 is just indescribably horrific. But if we set that to one side, I'm fascinated to understand, you know, from your perspective whether, and it sounds like there are, but whether you do see that there will be real benefits potentially for, you know, for professional people in terms of what their working world or the balance that they'll have in their lives going forward. Is there some positives there for you?
Yeah, I do believe, I mean, I've been listening to a lot of survey results that have been put out there. A lot of people have been surveyed during this time in their organizations asking, would they like to go back to work full time? Would they prefer full, remote or distributed? And the vast majority are coming back with something in between. So not full time back in the office, not full time, remote, but something where they have, say, for example, 2 days a week in the office, or something in between. So there seems to be this not necessarily new normal, but new better emerging, which I'm loving.
Yeah.
Because I think it levels the playing field. I think it levels the playing field from a gender perspective, because men and women can make those choices now, not just, it used to be just women asking and eventually having to, prove themselves to a point where they were allowed that flexibility. Across the board makes a lot more sense. So it's really interesting to see the changes that are happening, and that it's being accommodated, which I think makes just good business sense. People are now having a lot less office space to potentially pay for. They're looking at downsizing or sharing that space with other organizations or companies. It actually is starting to look like, you can potentially reduce costs in a way that increases workplace appreciation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And appreciating your workplace more only leads to better outcomes for all concerned, doesn't it?
Absolutely, right? So I think we'll just notice that, because people have been dying to get back into the office to a certain degree.
Oh, yes.
And I think, having that little bit of normality back, and that ability to have different kinds of conversations, and enjoy that human to human interaction. We're social beings. We prefer having social interaction. It's the way we're wired.
Oh, and this is week 5 of stage 4 restrictions for us in Melbourne, and that's certainly been on my mind a bit at the moment. Just that feeling at times a bit like a caged animal.
Yeah. I do remember hearing, every time you went out, you really weren't supposed to be out for longer than an hour. It really did feel like you were a caged animal looking out the window at the world.
Yes.
A very eerie world as well. No cars, no buses, no trains, no nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. It was really quite strange.
A bit dystopian, but anyway, let's continue talking about some more positive things. Hiam, I'm keen to delve a bit further into the distributed teams, and I know from our earlier conversation that there are 5 levels of distributed teams. I'd love if you could walk me through those, please.
Yeah, well, I've absolutely stolen this from a article I read with an interview with Matt Mullenweg, who's the founder of WordPress, and now an umbrella organization that includes WordPress called Autonomy. And he set up WordPress from the get-go to be fully distributed. That was his goal. So it's something that pre-COVID he had aimed for. Okay. And so he's, I guess, at the forefront of knowing what these levels look like. And he describes 5 different levels, but he describes the first level as just, the way things are, in the traditional sense, which is everyone is supposed to be in a physical business area or location, and that, we're really stuck in having that kind of centralized approach, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense anymore from a knowledge worker perspective. We do have all the tools and technology required, that if we wanted to be fully distributed, we can. But it's just that traditional feeling of we need to be seen, we need to be in an office, we need to be present. That's the reason why we do that.
Yes.
Level 2, he talks about is, we're now distributed. We're moving out of the office into our, another space, a local space, whether it's our home or whatever it might be. But we're very much recreating the habits of the office. So it's still 9 to 5. Instead of a in-person meeting, we're having a Zoom meeting for an hour, where people talk over each other. The loudest voice wins. that kind of situation. So really, we're not leveraging this technology. We're just using it to recreate what we know and feel is normal. Then I think he talks about level 3 being we're actually starting to adapt to the medium, which is, we're actually leveraging all the various cloud technologies. Like, for example, instead of a meeting where everybody's talking, we now have a doc open where we are collaborating together on that doc. You can see everybody adding their comments, questions, and we're actually leveraging technology and what's available to us to actually have better meetings than we would have ever had previously. So things start to move into a place where things then become quite goal orientated. We're having shorter meetings. For example, I think a lot of people are leveraging agile practice of stand-ups every day for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Things are drastically reducing in terms of the time we need because we're leveraging the mediums to such a great effect. So that's what level 3 looks like. And then level 4 is really interesting because I feel like this is where, organizations could really start moving towards. And that's where we are really working in a way that suits us. So if it suits me to meditate in the morning, go for a swim, and then start work at a certain time that I know that's when I'm going to do my best work, that's great for me. And there is no requirement for me to be, online from a certain time to a certain time. It's all about outcomes. It's all about results. It's not about the inputs. It's not about presenteeism at all anymore. So what that means then is that you can create a team of people from anywhere in the world. This really starts opening up the talent pool not to be geographically in a certain location. So what happens then is if you think about that, it means you can find the best people from anywhere in the world to work on a project, which is really exciting. And we get really good at handing the baton over to each other, and really projects can have almost like teams can work almost 24/7 based in the fact that they might be in different locations around the world. So I think that's really interesting. I'm excited to see where that goes. And then he talks about level 5, which is this nirvana, where everybody is healthy and well, and they do basically the work fits around their world. So if they surf, the conditions are right, they head off and surf and do yoga and do in the middle of a conference they might be having lunch with their family. There is no rules anymore, but great work is done because people feel really empowered to be well. And again, it's all about everyone is now working at a higher level and in a fully distributed way. So I'm not sure if I've totally captured his sentiment in that. That's what I took from his 5 levels of distributed teams. And he thinks that, one way if you've reached nirvana is that you no longer have one email in your inbox. The email is almost gone because you're leveraging every other way of communicating to such a high effect. So whether it be Slack, Asana, all the different tools that are out there for different reasons, it means that almost email is no longer needed. What a wonderful thought, hey?
Well, that indeed does sound like nirvana. just that part right there.
Imagine.
That I love that. I as you got higher up, I was sort of thinking, how can we make that better? Because already, level 3 was already sounding terribly appealing.
Great.
Are there organizations that are level 5 nirvana?
I don't think he thinks his organization is even there yet. I think this is something he's even aspiring towards. He does talk about other things which are really interesting, heading towards that nirvana stage, in that the vast majority of communication is over the written word. And hiring for that capability actually becomes really important. So if you think about your typical recruitment interview, it's usually verbal, right, over a phone call or whatever it might be. But actually assessing people's written communication skills will become even more important as you head into that world. And that, you know, really being able to live your culture through the written word is going to be another one. Always defaulting to perceiving others positively,
Yes.
because so much can be interpreted the wrong way from the written word. So this is going to be interesting, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about 7% is generally acknowledged of communication. The element, sorry, let me say that again, that was clumsy. In terms of the way that we communicate, only about 7% is the words that are actually used or written. I mean, the vast bulk of it is all those other things, you know, body language, tone of voice,
exactly.
all of those elements which you lose if it's merely written.
Absolutely. So you start then that's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
And then from there, so much can fall through the cracks. So it's really interesting, you know, the way behaviors play out through various forms of channels, I suppose, communication channels, it's really interesting. And that's where, you know, that's what he is thinking about from his team and organization's perspective.
Oh, I'm going to go away and do some research on him this afternoon. He sounds fascinating.
Yeah. It was a really interesting read, I must say.
Well, and I mean, the whole thing is, given that the vast bulk of, many of us are working remotely at the moment, it does, to a very large extent, enable us to set ourselves up in the ways that work better for us. I mean, even in our household, I'm an early morning person, so I get up and take the dog for a run and then have breakfast with my son, who's also a morning person, whereas my husband is a night owl, as is our daughter. And so he is up working, you know, well past when I've gone to bed, but then, you know, we'll often fit in a few things during the day when I'm sort of sitting at laptop. So that's also been a really interesting evolution just in my own little bubble to observe.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm noticing that, just as you say that myself, with our family unit, that there is the kind of preferences playing out in the house. I'm definitely first to bed in the evening. You know, and my husband would definitely be the night owl, and he'll do a bit of work before maybe putting on a movie or something. But yes, you're right. We are all kind of moving into that space of maybe we're at level 3 or in the house and level 2 in the workplace. I don't know, but yeah, it's interesting that you've spotted that. I didn't myself until now. Well done.
Oh well, you prompted it with the discussion, so thank you. Now, I'm keen to get into that in a little bit more detail. How do you set up a team for success when there are divergent views about what an ideal operating model looks like? And I even, just from conversations, just before I hand over to you to answer the question, I just even within teams that I'm a part of and talking to friends and people within my network, some people who are much more introverted are actually really happy with the current setup, you know, that it's feeding them and it works really well for them, whereas, you know, other people who are more extrovert like me are really struggling and missing that social connection. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on this front.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think, like in a home where we might decide, you know, what are our kind of goals this year as a family? What do we want to achieve? I think the same is true for a workplace. Now more so than ever, I think we're going to have to renegotiate what is it we want to achieve together as a team, and how are we going to achieve that? What's the operating model going to look like? What's the best way of working together? What do we all need? And how can we work around those needs? So it really does boil down to those two very key questions, and I think they need to be revised often. I think the typical strategic plan whether it's annual or biannual, is not going to cut it anymore in the world that we're living now. We're going to have to revise our goals quarterly at a minimum, and see what's really achievable. What do we want to double down and focus on? And again, how are we going to work together so that we can achieve those particular goals? So the how is always really interesting. You know, at the beginning of any client project, I'll always say, you know, how do we want to work together? You know, what will make this project go really smoothly for you? And we write that up, and we hold ourselves account to that. And I ask, you know, can I hold you account to this? And it's really interesting what we say and then what we end up doing are two very different things. So I definitely think you should not only make it very clear how we're going to work together, but almost appoint somebody to hold everyone to account to that, because they slip very quickly. And then I think one thing I've noticed is, again, the shorter cycles seem to be working in the times that we're in, you know, bi-weekly sprints, retrospectives where we review how the last 2 weeks went. Did we hold ourselves to the how we want to be together? If not, why not? What's working for us? What's not working for us? So really reviewing how we're working and what we're working on, you know, in short little sprints, maybe every 2 weeks seems to work for teams, and just carving out that time. Don't let that time slip away.
That's really interesting. Do you think that move to a much shorter cycle from a planning perspective will continue as and when we start to come out of the, you know, the current unusual COVID existence?
I think people were working towards that before COVID, to be honest. We've heard so much about traditional organization adopting kind of agile practices, which were traditionally more for the software development world, but seem to be easy to adapt into any team, any organization. So I think that was a trend pre-COVID. Now, I think that's just been accelerated because it just seems to work for distributed teams quite well. And people are doing it in their own way. They're you know, sometimes a morning stand-up can be 10 minutes for some teams, and I've actually even heard stand-ups can go as long as 2 hours. I don't know if that's really technically a stand-up, but the goal is there for it to be shorter and shorter. And I think the point is that people are realizing that more frequent communication works better when we are fully distributed. So that's, but shorter. I think people are very much getting tired and potentially a little bit stressed with far too many meetings, and that they're jamming up our calendars.
Yeah, well, and I read some research recently from Microsoft talking about Zoom fatigue and the fact that it's more taxing and more tiring for people than face-to-face meetings.
It is. I don't know why. There is some science behind it as to why it is more draining. It's just not natural, I suppose, to be aware of so many things. I think you're kind of hyper aware when you see everybody quite up close on a screen. You're picking up on all these little you know, cues and maybe a little bit of body language, and you're trying to read. I think it's a little bit different if you were sitting around a big table or in an office environment. So I think our brains are not tuned into this yet.
No, the overdrive element.
And it's taking a lot out of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that you've seen significant changes in the ways that many organisations are working, and you know, you talked about lots of teams sort of trying a new mini sprint approach, so test and learn, launch and iterate, which is really encouraging from a cross-team collaboration perspective when people are in different locations. I'd love to hear a bit more about some of your observations.
Yeah, it's amazing to see. As I mentioned, pre-COVID, I think some of the organizations I worked with were really just dabbling in this, but more leaning towards their traditional structures and, processes, whereas now there is a lot more beyond dabbling and really embedding these principles and tools and ceremonies into their daily, weekly, fortnightly activities. And what I really am noticing is that there's more, with all of this, what kind of is emerging is that teams and organizations are more comfortable with putting things out that are not 100% perfect. Because the whole point around this is, as you mentioned, just their launch, iterate, test, learn, constantly evolve. Whereas previously, putting something out that wasn't entirely perfect for some organizations, especially those that had excellence, for example, in their values, would have been unheard of. So I think we're learning from this that things don't have to be fully baked and perfect before they go out, maybe to a small group of customers to test and get some feedback on. Things you are able to put something out that you can, learn from and change, and it will evolve as customer needs evolve. So it's teaching us to be happy within the imperfect, constantly listen to the customer. Customer centricity is key. And that's definitely something that's coming out as a result of these new ways of working, and also just for clients, not for clients, but for organizations, just to remain relevant in the times that we're in. The needs of people are changing dramatically. So what they specialized in before might just not be necessary now, or relevant, or even possible. So they're having to pivot and try new things quickly. And that's the kind of practices that is perfect for that.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there are lots of examples of organisations and people doing that superbly. In fact, one that comes to mind for me, a friend told me about Stage Kings, who were an organisation in Sydney who previously worked on large events, large live events, and staging and whatnot. And their business in March died overnight, or, hit the wall. And they pivoted to making some really great stuff, like desks and laptop stands and monitor stands and a whole lot of stuff that they'd simply never done before. And I've had 6 months working at the dining table with 4 recipe books, propping up my laptop to a decent level. And on Friday, ordered a laptop stand from them, which arrived this morning, Wednesday. And, 5 pieces, grooves, easy to put together, even as someone who is challenged by IKEA. I did it in about a minute. And it's awesome. And I just think that's such a superb example of innovation, and being faced with the horrendous reality that your revenue has dried up overnight, just such a phenomenal example of that.
Absolutely. And that's such a great example, as well as kind of looking at things in terms of, well, what hasn't changed? We still have a great team. We have great talent. We have ideas. We have other opportunities. What are the, so you've got to, I suppose, what a lot of organizations can fall into is looking at what they've lost, or what they haven't got anymore. And I think the organizations that seem to be doing okay or well out of this is they're looking at what they do have, and they're looking at how they can repurpose that. And more often than not, what they have are great people, motivated people with diverse talents. So I think that's what I'm noticing when those organizations do completely make a 180. I mean, that's a great example of an organization that went from staging events to distributing furniture. Office furniture. Wow.
Fab. And it's Scandi and minimalist looking, and it's awesome. But even if it was a bit ugly, I love the story. I would support them.
Yeah. Right, exactly. And we've heard some great stories of, gin distributors that are now making hand sanitizer and stuff like that came out of all of this. So many great examples, and then so many sad examples of organizations that just weren't set up culturally to make that shift. It's asking a lot of an organization, a huge amount,
isn't it? So, and I know that you've said before that where that your observation is that where an organisation's culture was at the start of COVID will have accelerated. So if you'd had lots of focus on your culture early on, before all of this hit, you're likely to be in better shape. Why is that? I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think culture is not something that is going to evolve in a good way unless it's intentional. So I do believe that companies that put a lot of intentional thought into the culture that they wanted, into the behaviors that they want to see more of, the behaviors that will allow people to do their best work in our organization, they have found that those values and the purpose behind that organization really help to guide every single person, every single decision, every single interaction, without the leaders necessarily needing to micromanage everything. So that's what I kind of meant by, if you put that thought and effort into your culture, you will probably have done okay, if not well, with this type of massive disruption. People who've not, unfortunately, put a huge amount of effort and kind of let the culture evolve on its own, more often than not, that culture ends up being quite low trust, and all the things that we noticed before in terms of what low trust can look like happen. And when that all happens, and then some massive disruption comes along, like what we're seeing with COVID, it only accelerates that air of, for example, low trust, of micromanagement, of feeling disconnected from the organization, of feeling isolated, uncared for, devalued. That's only going to worsen with the circumstances that organizations have got in front of them.
Well, I think that we need to end on a positive note, Hiam, because most of this conversation has been uplifting and encouraging. So my last question, although I would like to talk to you for hours, is there something through this period that has truly delighted you?
Look, I think what I've noticed is that people in general have taken this pandemic as a personal opportunity to reflect and reset for themselves individually. So many were running at a really unsustainable pace, and this has afforded us a bit of time, an unexpected opportunity just to pause and reflect on what's important to us, be it family, be it health, be it friends, be it whatever it might be. We're having that time now to do that. And I think because of that, workplaces are also going to rethink their why, to be more connected to that why. They will take this opportunity to clarify the value they create in the world, and that in turn kind of helps employees to solidify a sense of belonging and meaning in their work. So I'm hoping, this is my hope, and this is what I am seeing a little bit more of now, is organizations are rethinking their purpose, they're rethinking their values, they're reigniting passion in their employees. And that I know can be really hard, especially when there's layoffs, for example, happening. How do you motivate the people that are left behind? Well, really, really connect back into what you're here to do, and just get back to that core piece. So I'm hoping that workplaces will be forever changed, but in a good way. I think they'll be reimagined. I think the actual, workplace is really going to be a mix of virtual and bricks and mortars in the future. I don't think offices will be used for, what we used to use them for. I think there'll be a place of connection and collaboration. So I think that's going to change, I hope, forever. Yes, like I said before, I think the cards have been thrown up in the air, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where they land. I think there's good stuff ahead.
What a glorious note to end on. Hiam, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting and incredibly thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you for having me, Katie.
It's been awesome. And thank you for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, it'd be great if you could take a few seconds to share it and review me on iTunes to help others find this fantastic content. I read all of the feedback and greatly enjoy it. I have some excellent thought leaders coming up in the series. Subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode. You can find me at Katie B Marketing on Twitter or Katie Bennett-Stenton